Most of the women who married into Hitler's inner circle ended their stories in blood. Magda Goebbels poisoned her own 6 children in a Berlin bunker before taking her own life. Eva Braun swallowed cyanide beside the man she had waited 15 years to marry, dead within a day of the wedding. Others clung to the ideology until their final breath, refusing to admit that anything had gone wrong, defending husbands who had helped orchestrate the murder of millions right up until the moment they themselves died decades later, still unrepentant. But one woman broke that pattern completely. She did not die in a bunker. She did not poison her child. She did not poison her child. She did not spend the next 40 years insisting the Third Reich had been misunderstood. She went to prison. She lost her fortune. She rebuilt a small, quiet life in a rebuilt German city, and she died in her own bed at the age of 80. Her name was Emmy Göring, and in almost every way that mattered, she was the opposite of every other Nazi wife. So how did the woman once crowned the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich end up as the rare example of a Nazi spouse who simply survived ordinarily, quietly, without a final act of fanaticism or despair, growing old in a rebuilt city while so many of the women around her met far more violent or far more defiant ends? In this video, we will find out. So without further ado, let's start at the beginning. In a prosperous merchant household in Hamburg, decades before anyone had ever heard the name Hermann Göring. Emma Johanna Henny Sonnemann was born in Hamburg on March 24, 1893, the youngest of 5 children in a comfortable, well-off family. Her father worked as a salesman, and the household she grew up in gave her an education and a degree of independence that many German women of her generation never received. From an early age, she was drawn to performance. She wanted the stage, not the parlour, and she pursued that ambition with a seriousness that stood out among her peers. She trained as an actress in Hamburg under the respected director Leopold Jessner, absorbing the discipline and technique of German theatre at a moment when the country's stage culture was among the most vibrant in Europe. It was a path that required nerve. Acting was not considered a particularly respectable profession for a woman from a bourgeois merchant family in the early 20th century, and yet Emmy pursued it anyway, eventually building a career that would carry her onto some of Germany's most prestigious stages, including a long tenure at the National Theatre in Weimar. In late 1916, in the middle of the First World War, Emmy married a fellow actor named Karl Köstlin, taking his name and becoming Emmy Köstlin. Details about the marriage itself are relatively thin in the historical record, a reminder that not every chapter of a well-documented life gets equal attention from history, but what is known is that the union did not last. The couple eventually divorced, with most accounts placing the separation around the mid-1920s, and Emmy returned to her maiden professional identity and continued building her career on the stage. By the early 1930s, she was an established, respected actress, performing regularly in Weimar and developing something of a reputation that reached well beyond the theatre district. She was, by any measure, an independent professional woman who had built her own life and her own name before she ever crossed paths with the man who would define the rest of her existence in the eyes of history. That crossing happened in the early 1930s as the National Socialist movement was consolidating its hold over German political life. Hermann Göring, already one of Hitler's most prominent lieutenants and a decorated First World War fighter ace before that, had lost his first wife, the Swedish noblewoman Karin von Kantzow, in October 1931. Karin had suffered from tuberculosis and heart trouble for years, and her death left Göring, by most accounts, genuinely devastated. He would later name his sprawling country estate in the Schorfheide forest Karinhall in her memory, a monument in brick and timber to a marriage that had ended too soon. Grief, however, did not keep Göring away from Weimar's theatre scene, and it was there, sometime in the early 1930s, that he met Emmy Sonnemann. Accounts describe a courtship that developed against the backdrop of Göring's rapid rise through the Nazi hierarchy, as he transformed from a party functionary into one of the most powerful men in Germany, eventually becoming President of the Reichstag, Minister-President of Prussia, and the founding architect of the Gestapo, before handing that organization off to Heinrich Himmler. The wedding, when it finally came, was less a private ceremony than a state occasion. On April 10, 1935, Emmy Sonnemann married Hermann Göring at the Berlin Cathedral in a ceremony deliberately staged as one of the regime's grandest propaganda spectacles. Adolf Hitler himself served as best man, standing at the side of a man he considered not just a loyal deputy, but something close to a designated successor. Luftwaffe fighter planes performed a flyover above the cathedral. Crowds lined the streets. The wedding was covered extensively in the German press, framed as a fairy tale union between one of the regime's most celebrated war heroes and a beloved stage actress, and it cemented Emmy's position at the very centre of Nazi high society. She was no longer simply an actress with a respectable career. She was now Frau Göring, wife of the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, and the machinery of Nazi propaganda made sure the entire country knew it. What followed was a rapid transformation. Emmy retired from acting almost immediately after the wedding, trading the stage for a role that, in its own way, required just as much performance, hostess to the Nazi elite, and increasingly stand-in First Lady for a regime whose actual head of state had no wife of his own. Adolf Hitler was unmarried throughout his years in power, at least publicly, and the absence of an official First Lady left a symbolic vacuum at the top of Nazi Germany's social hierarchy. Emmy Göring moved to fill it. She organised and hosted receptions for foreign dignitaries, presided over state functions, and appeared constantly at Hitler's side during ceremonial occasions, cultivating a public image as the closest thing the Third Reich had to a First Lady. She began to refer to herself, and to be referred to by others in Berlin society, using precisely that unofficial title, the First Lady of the Third Reich. It was a claim with no legal or constitutional basis whatsoever, but in the theatre of Nazi high society, where perception often mattered more than formal title, it stuck. That claim, however, was not made in a vacuum, and it would not go unchallenged. Adolf Hitler did, in fact, have a companion, even if he kept her carefully out of public view for most of the regime's existence. Her name was Eva Braun, a young woman roughly 23 years Hitler's junior who had become his mistress years earlier, but who was deliberately concealed from the German public for the entirety of the Nazi period. Braun was rarely photographed, never introduced at state functions, and essentially erased from the regime's public-facing propaganda, confined largely to Hitler's private retreat at the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps. It was an arrangement that suited Hitler's carefully constructed public image as a man wedded only to the German nation, but it left Eva Braun in an almost impossible social position. The most intimate companion of the Führer, with no title, no public acknowledgement, and no standing whatsoever in the ceremonial life of the regime she was, in every private sense, a part of. Into that vacuum walked Emmy Göring, publicly styling herself First Lady of the Third Reich, while the woman who actually shared Hitler's private life sat unacknowledged in the Bavarian mountains. The result was a rivalry that Nazi Germany's court gossip never quite forgot. Emmy, by multiple contemporaneous accounts, treated Eva Braun with open condescension, snubbing her at the rare functions where their paths crossed, and making little effort to disguise her belief that a former Führer's typist and photographer's assistant had no real claim to social standing next to the wife of the Reich's second most powerful man. The slights did not go unnoticed. Word reportedly reached Hitler himself, who was said to be furious at the treatment of Braun, and who issued pointed instructions to Hermann Göring, demanding that his wife show Eva more respect going forward. The friction never fully resolved. One lasting consequence was that Emmy found herself excluded from invitations to the Berghof, Hitler's private Bavarian retreat, effectively barred from the one place where Eva Braun's status was undisputed. Braun herself, according to accounts from those close to the inner circle, never fully forgave Emmy for the years of condescension, holding a private grudge against a woman who had spent years publicly claiming a title that, in the strictest sense, belonged to no one, but which Braun might have reasonably felt was hers by right of intimacy, if not by law. Emmy's rivalry was not limited to Eva Braun. Magda Goebbels, the poised and politically ambitious wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, occupied a similar tier of Nazi high society, and the two women reportedly developed a competitive relationship of their own, each seemingly determined to outshine the other at Berlin's endless rotation of state receptions and gala events. Magda, who had once briefly been courted by Hitler himself before her marriage to Goebbels, and who cultivated her own reputation as a woman of taste, culture, and political seriousness, hosted lavish functions that rivaled Emmy's in scale and extravagance. Contemporary accounts describe the two women essentially competing to see who could dress more expensively, host more elaborately, and command more attention at the same events, a quiet contest for social supremacy playing out beneath the surface of the regime's more visible power struggles among the men. It is a detail worth pausing on, because Magda Goebbels will return later in this story in circumstances almost impossible to reconcile with the glittering, competitive hostess of the mid-1930s. But we will get to that. For now, in the years immediately following her marriage, Emmy Göring's life was one of almost unimaginable privilege. Her husband was, by the outbreak of the Second World War, one of the wealthiest men in Europe, a distinction built substantially on the systematic plunder of art, property and wealth confiscated from Jewish families and other groups the Nazi regime had classified as enemies of the state. Hermann Göring owned mansions, estates and castles scattered across Germany, Austria and occupied Poland, and he assembled one of the largest private art collections in the world, much of it looted directly from museums, galleries and private Jewish collectors across occupied Europe. Emmy lived inside that plunder, presiding over households staffed and furnished by the proceeds of dispossession, even if she herself held no formal role in the confiscations themselves. It is a detail that matters for understanding the moral complexity of her later fate. She was never charged with participating in the looting or the persecution that funded her lifestyle. But she benefited from it, directly and lavishly, for years, and any honest accounting of her life has to hold both of those things at once. A woman who did not personally order atrocities, living in extraordinary comfort, built substantially on the wreckage of people who had. The couple's daughter, Eva Göring, was born on June 2, 1938, and her arrival became yet another occasion for regime spectacle. Hermann Göring, delighted at the birth of a healthy child relatively late in his life, reportedly ordered 500 Luftwaffe planes to fly over Berlin in celebration, declaring that he would have doubled the number to a full 1,000 had the child been a boy. The birth also generated an ugly rumour spread in 1940 by the virulently anti-Semitic propaganda paper Der Stürmer, suggesting Edda had been conceived through artificial insemination, a smear apparently intended to humiliate Göring by implying some deficiency on his part. It was precisely the kind of poisonous, invasive gossip that circulated constantly in the hothouse atmosphere of Nazi high society, where even a birth announcement could become a weapon in the regime's endless internal rivalries. There was also, separately, public speculation about where the unusual name Edda had come from, with many assuming it was chosen in tribute to Edda Ciano, the eldest daughter of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and a prominent figure in her own right as the wife of Italy's foreign minister. Emmy herself later disputed that explanation in her memoir, insisting the name had been chosen after a personal friend, rather than as a diplomatic gesture toward Rome, though the political convenience of the timing has kept the alternative explanation alive in popular accounts ever since. By December 1938, Emmy's integration into the machinery of the Nazi state reached a symbolic milestone when she was given membership in the National Socialist German Workers' Party as a Christmas gift, an induction she had not personally sought or applied for, but accepted nonetheless. It was a detail she would lean on heavily years later when facing formal judgment for her association with the regime, an attempt to frame her party membership as something bestowed upon her rather than actively pursued, a passive accessory to her marriage rather than a considered political commitment. Whether that framing holds up under scrutiny is one of the questions any fair account of her life has to sit with, because the line between passive proximity to power and active participation in a criminal regime is rarely as clean as the people living through it like to claim after the fact. What is not in dispute is the scale of the platform Emmy occupied. As war approached and then consumed Europe, she remained a fixture of Nazi ceremonial life, styled after 1940 as Frau Reichsmarschall, following her husband's elevation to the unique rank of Reichsmarschall, a title created specifically to place Göring above every other officer in the German military. She organised receptions, hosted foreign dignitaries and remained a constant photographed presence at the pinnacle of the regime's social hierarchy, even as the war her husband's air force had helped launch consumed millions of lives across the continent. She held no formal government position and made no claim to policy influence. Her role was ceremonial, social, symbolic. But it was also, undeniably, a role performed at the very center of one of history's most murderous regimes, and the question of how much responsibility that proximity carries would eventually be put to a court, though not the kind of court that tried her husband. That reckoning, however, was still years away. For most of the 1930s and into the early years of the war, Emmy Göring's life continued along its glittering, insulated track. The parties, the estates, the furs, the jewels, the endless photographs in illustrated magazines showing off a lifestyle most Germans, increasingly rationed and later bombed into rubble, could only imagine. Carinhall, the vast hunting estate in the Schorfheide forest that Hermann had named for his first wife, became the family's primary residence and a favourite venue for lavish entertaining. Its walls lined with looted masterpieces and its grounds stocked with game for Göring's hunting expeditions. Emmy's own name found its way onto the property too, in a smaller, more private tribute. Göring's hunting lodge at Romintin, in what is now the Kaliningrad region of Russia, was informally known as Emmy Hall, a quieter counterpart to the grander Carinhall, named for the wife who had come before her. But history rarely lets privilege of that scale last indefinitely, and the storm gathering over Nazi Germany would eventually reach even the gilded world of Carinhall. Before we follow Emmy into the collapse of that world, though, it's worth pausing to properly introduce the women whose fates her own story stands in such sharp contrast to, because understanding exactly how differently things ended for Emmy Göring requires understanding exactly what happened to the others first. And few of those stories are as harrowing or as different from Emmy's eventual fate as what happened to the woman she had spent years quietly competing with at Berlin's grandest parties, Magda Goebbels. Magda Goebbels was, in almost every visible respect, everything Emmy Göring appeared to be on the surface. Elegant, politically connected, endlessly photographed and fiercely committed to projecting the image of Nazi Germany's ideal wife and mother. Born Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl in 1901, she had a complicated cosmopolitan upbringing that included a period living with a Jewish stepfather and attending a Jewish girls' school in Brussels. A biographical detail she would later work hard to obscure once she rose to prominence in a regime built on anti-Semitic ideology. Her first marriage, to a wealthy industrialist more than twice her age, ended in divorce in 1929, leaving her financially independent and socially prominent in Berlin at precisely the moment the Nazi movement was gaining momentum. She was drawn into party circles, briefly caught Hitler's personal interest, and eventually married propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels in December 1931, with Hitler serving as a witness at the wedding, a mirror of the role he would later play at Emmy's own ceremony 4 years later. Magda embraced the role of model Nazi wife and mother with an intensity that went well beyond performance. She and Goebbels had 6 children together between 1932 and 1940, all given names beginning with the letter H in tribute to Hitler. A detail that captures just how completely she had fused her family identity with loyalty to the regime and to Hitler personally. She was genuinely close to Hitler, one of the few women in his inner circle he trusted implicitly, and she remained fiercely devoted to both her husband and to National Socialist ideology, even as Goebbels' serial infidelities strained their marriage, and at one point in 1938 nearly ended it entirely before Hitler personally intervened to keep the couple together for the sake of the regime's public image. It is worth sitting with that detail for a moment, the dictator of Germany personally mediating a marital crisis because a divorce between his propaganda minister and his wife would have damaged the party's carefully cultivated image of family values. That is how central Magda Goebbels had become to the performance of Nazi domestic ideology. And it is precisely that fanatical, all-consuming identification with the regime that would determine her final horrifying act 4 years later, an act with absolutely no parallel anywhere in Emmy Göring's story. We will return to exactly what happened to Magda Goebbels and to Eva Braun and to several other Nazi wives whose fates diverged so sharply from Emmy's own later in this video. For now, though, let's return to Emmy Göring herself and to the moment when the glittering world of Carinhall, the furs and the flyovers and the endless receptions finally began to collapse around her. That collapse did not happen overnight. It crept in gradually, in step with the deteriorating fortunes of the war itself. Hermann Göring's own standing within the regime began eroding well before the final defeat, and the erosion mattered enormously for Emmy because her entire social position depended on her husband's proximity to Hitler's favour. The turning point is usually traced to the Battle of Britain in 1940, when Göring's Luftwaffe failed to achieve the air superiority it had promised, and it deepened catastrophically after the disastrous attempt to supply the encircled German Sixth Army at Stalingrad by air in the winter of 1942 and 1943, a promise Göring made personally to Hitler and then failed to deliver, at a cost of roughly 250,000 German soldiers trapped in the Soviet pocket. From that point forward, Göring's influence inside Hitler's inner circle declined steadily, even as his public honours and ceremonial titles remained intact. He retreated increasingly to Karenhall, spending his time on his art collection and his hunting estates, rather than active military command, a withdrawal that only deepened Hitler's private contempt for a man he had once considered his likely successor. For Emmy, the war years brought a strange, disorienting mixture of continued privilege and creeping unease. The receptions continued, the estates remained staffed and stocked, and the family's material comfort persisted largely undisturbed, even as Allied bombing campaigns began reducing German cities to rubble and turning the tide of the war decisively against the Reich. But the ground was shifting beneath the glamour. Whispered criticism of Göring's failures, particularly the collapse of the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace from increasingly relentless Allied bombing raids, grew louder within the regime's upper echelons, even if it rarely reached Emmy directly. She continued playing hostess, continued appearing at Hitler's side at state occasions when required, and continued, by most accounts, believing in the ultimate rightness and inevitable victory of the cause her husband had helped build, even as the military reality on every front told a different story. The final unravelling came with brutal speed in the last weeks of April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin and Hitler retreated permanently into his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. On April 23rd, with Hitler apparently trapped and cut off from communication in besieged Berlin, Göring, who had relocated to Obersalzberg in Bavaria, sent a telegram invoking a 1941 decree that named him Hitler's designated successor should the Führer become incapacitated. Göring's telegram asked whether Hitler wanted him to assume leadership of the Reich immediately, given the apparent breakdown in communications from the besieged capital. It was, on its face, a reasonable question grounded in existing succession law. Hitler, however, isolated and increasingly paranoid in his final days, interpreted it as an act of treachery, an attempted coup by a subordinate eager to seize power while his Führer still lived. Enraged, Hitler stripped Göring of all his titles, expelled him from the Nazi Party, and ordered his arrest by the SS. For a tense period, Göring and his family were held under armed guard at Obersalzberg by SS troops, with orders that, according to several post-war accounts, may have included instructions to execute the entire family if Berlin fell or if American forces approached too closely. Emmy and Edda were confined alongside Hermann during this period, and by Emmy's own later account, it was among the most frightening stretches of the entire war. A sudden, vertiginous fall from the summit of Nazi high society to armed captivity at the hands of the very organisation her husband had once helped build. The SS Guard detail was eventually withdrawn or overpowered as the regime disintegrated in early May 1945, and on May 6th, with Berlin already fallen and Hitler dead by his own hand a week earlier, Hermann Göring surrendered to advancing American forces near Berchtesgaden, formally ending his brief, terrifying detention and beginning a new and very different kind of captivity, one that would ultimately determine the fate of his entire family. Emmy and 6-year-old Edda were taken into custody separately, their glittering world reduced within a matter of days to internment camps, interrogation rooms, and an uncertain future utterly unlike anything either of them had ever known. The First Lady of the Third Reich, as Emmy had styled herself for a decade, was now simply a prisoner, and what came next would begin to reveal just how different her path through defeat would be from the other women who had shared her rarefied world at the top of Nazi Germany. Emmy and Edda's initial internment took them to a facility in Luxembourg, where they were held alongside other relatives of senior Nazi officials, while the Allies sorted out what to do with the enormous population of regime insiders now in their custody. Conditions were austere and, for a mother and a 6-year-old child who had spent their entire lives inside some of the most opulent residences in Europe, genuinely shocking in their deprivation. Emmy later described this period, in her own memoir written decades afterward, as among the hardest stretches of her life, marked by isolation, cramped quarters, restricted communication with the outside world, and the constant uncertainty of not knowing what would happen to her husband, who had by then been transferred into American custody to await trial as one of the most senior surviving figures of the Nazi regime. It is worth noting, if only for the sake of proportion, that whatever hardship Emmy and Edda experienced during their internment paled beside what millions of displaced persons, camp survivors and refugees were enduring across a shattered Europe during that same summer of 1945, a contrast that Emmy's own later writings rarely, if ever, fully acknowledged. By the time the International Military Tribunal convened in Nuremberg in November 1945 to try the surviving leadership of the Nazi regime, Emmy and Edda had been moved again, eventually settling into more stable, if still far from comfortable, housing arrangements in Bavaria, including a small house in the village of Sackdilling by the spring of 1946. Hermann Göring, meanwhile, sat as the most senior defendant in the dock at Nuremberg, the highest-ranking Nazi official to survive the war's end and stand trial. He was permitted limited contact with his family during the proceedings, including correspondence relayed in part through Douglas Kelly, the American Army psychiatrist assigned to evaluate the mental fitness of the Nuremberg defendants, who developed an unusual rapport with Göring over the course of the trial. Kelly would later describe Göring as intelligent, manipulative, and disturbingly charming even in captivity, qualities that had clearly shaped his relationship with Emmy as much as his political career. According to later accounts, Edda was even permitted a supervised visit to see her father in prison during this period, an emotional encounter that left a lasting mark on both of them when Göring learned that his young daughter had told someone she hoped to see her father again in heaven. He reportedly wept, one of the rare moments of visible emotion recorded from a man who spent most of his Nuremberg testimony defiant, evasive, and unrepentant about the regime's crimes. The trial itself, of course, was never about Emmy. She was not a defendant, faced no war crimes charges, and played no role in the courtroom proceedings beyond her position as the wife of the man in the dock. But the verdict, when it came in the autumn of 1946, would reshape the entire remainder of her life. Hermann Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts brought against him, including crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, for his role in launching Germany's wars of aggression and in the systematic plunder and persecution carried out across occupied Europe, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. He requested execution by firing squad instead, a soldier's death rather than what he considered the humiliation of the gallows, a request the tribunal denied. On the night of October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring swallowed a hidden cyanide capsule in his cell and died before the sentence could be carried out, a final act of defiance that denied the Allies the execution they had planned and left historians debating for decades exactly how he had managed to smuggle the poison past his guards. For Emmy, the news meant the end of a marriage that had begun with flyovers over Berlin Cathedral and ended with a cyanide capsule in a Nuremberg prison cell. She was now a widow, stripped of her titles, her fortune largely confiscated, and facing an uncertain reckoning of her own with the denazification courts that were, by then, working their way through the vast population of Germans who had benefited from or participated in the machinery of the Nazi state. That reckoning, and everything that followed it, is where the second half of Emmy Göring's remarkable story truly begins. Widowed, stripped of her fortune, and no longer protected by her husband's rank, Emmy Göring now had to answer for her own association with the Nazi Party in front of a German denazification tribunal, the network of courts the Allied occupation authorities established to sort the German population into categories ranging from major offenders down to those exonerated of any real involvement. Emmy's case was heard before a Spruchkammer, a denazification panel, in the Bavarian town of Garmisch-Partenkirchen, with hearings that began in July 1948, nearly 2 years after her husband's suicide. Prosecutors scrutinized her Nazi Party membership, the financial benefits she had drawn from her marriage to one of the regime's most powerful and corrupt figures, and her years of ceremonial hosting duties as the self-styled First Lady of the Third Reich, arguing that the role constituted active, willing endorsement of the regime, even though there was no evidence she had participated in any specific decision-making, persecution, or atrocity herself. Emmy's defense leaned heavily on the narrative she would spend the rest of her life refining, that she was, at heart, an apolitical actress who had married into power rather than sought it, that her party membership had been an unsolicited Christmas gift rather than a considered ideological commitment, and that her role had been social and ceremonial rather than political in any meaningful sense. It was a defense with some genuine basis, in fact, and a considerable amount of convenient self-editing, the kind of account that tends to emerge whenever a person who benefited enormously from a criminal system tries to explain after the fact why none of that benefit should be held against them. The court was not entirely persuaded. In 1948, Emmy Göring was classified as Belastetter, meaning incriminated, placing her in Category 2 of the denazification scale, a designation reserved for active supporters and beneficiaries of the regime rather than mere nominal members or bystanders. She was convicted and sentenced to 1 year of imprisonment in a labour camp. Because Emmy had already spent a substantial period in Allied internment before the formal hearing, roughly 14 months by some accounts once her time in Luxembourg and various Bavarian holding facilities was tallied, she served only a comparatively brief additional stretch before her release, with several accounts placing her final release date around July 21st of that year. As part of the sentence, the tribunal ordered the confiscation of 30% of her remaining property, a punitive measure aimed at clawing back some of the material benefits she had drawn from her husband's looted fortune, though by that point much of the Göring's wealth had already been seized, scattered or claimed by other Allied restitution processes, targeting the vast collection of art and valuables Hermann had accumulated during the war. The court also barred her from performing professionally on stage for a period of 5 years, a restriction that, whatever its punitive intent, effectively closed off the one career path Emmy had built entirely on her own, before she had ever met Hermann Göring, adding a layer of irony to her punishment. The identity she had voluntarily set aside to become Frau Reichsmarschall was now denied to her by court order, even after the marriage that had displaced it was long over. How harsh was that sentence, really? It's a fair question, and one worth sitting with for a moment, because the honest answer is not very, especially set against the scale of what the regime she had spent a decade glorifying had actually done. A year in a labour camp, a partial property seizure, and a 5-year stage ban is a modest reckoning for a woman who had spent years as the public face of Nazi high society, presiding over a household built on looted art and confiscated Jewish property, hosting the very men who were, in some cases, simultaneously overseeing the machinery of persecution and murder unfolding across occupied Europe. Emmy Göring's case exemplifies one of the recurring complexities of the entire denazification process. The wives, hostesses, and social fixtures of the regime, who had wielded no formal power and issued no criminal orders themselves, but who had unmistakably benefited from and lent social legitimacy to a genocidal government, were in the end rarely made to answer for that proximity in any proportionate way. Justice, in Emmy's case, was real but limited, a year behind barbed wire rather than a rope or a life sentence, and whether that outcome represents fairness or simply the practical limits of denazification's ability to punish social complicity is a question historians still debate, one without a tidy consensus answer even among scholars who have spent entire careers studying the post-war reckoning with Nazi Germany. After her release from custody, Emmy Göring did something that almost none of the other prominent Nazi wives managed, or perhaps even attempted. She quietly disappeared into ordinary German civilian life. She secured a small apartment in a newly rebuilt section of Munich, a modest, unremarkable flat that stood in stark, almost surreal contrast to Carinhol's looted grandeur, and she settled there for what would turn out to be the remaining quarter-century of her life. There was no dramatic flight abroad, no attempt to build a new identity under an assumed name, no defiant public campaign to rehabilitate the memory of the Third Reich. She raised Edda as a single mother in reduced but stable circumstances, navigating the same post-war shortages, rebuilding, and slow economic recovery that shaped the lives of millions of ordinary Germans during the early years of the Federal Republic. She was not, however, entirely silent about her past. In 1967, Emmy published a memoir titled An der Seite meines Mannes, which translates roughly to By My Husband's Side, later released in English in 1972, under the title My Life with Göring. The book offered her account of the marriage, the war years, and the collapse of the regime. And it did what most memoirs written by people who benefited from catastrophic historical crimes tend to do. It emphasized her personal devotion to her husband, framed her political involvement as minimal and largely coerced by circumstance, and generally avoided any deep reckoning with the scale of what the regime she had helped glamorize had actually done to millions of people across Europe. It was not a confession. It was closer to a defense brief, decades after the verdict had already been handed down, an attempt to shape how history would remember a woman who had once styled herself First Lady of the Third Reich, and who clearly still, even in old age, wanted the public record to be kinder to her than the historical facts entirely warranted. Even so, the book's very existence marks another point of contrast with several of the other Nazi wives whose stories we'll turn to shortly. Emmy Göring lived long enough to write her own account, to see it published in 2 languages, to watch the post-war Federal Republic of Germany grow into a stable democracy, and to grow old as an ordinary, if quietly notorious, private citizen in a rebuilt Munich apartment. In her final years, she suffered from sciatica, a painful nerve condition affecting the leg and lower back, a mundane, almost banal ailment utterly unlike the violent ends that claimed so many of the other women who had once shared her social world at the summit of Nazi Germany. Emmy Göring died in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80 and was buried in the city's Waldfriedhof cemetery. She had outlived her husband by nearly 27 years, outlived the Third Reich by 28 years, and had spent the vast majority of that time not defiantly proclaiming the righteousness of the cause she had once glamorized, and not performing a public act of contrition either, but simply living quietly in the wreckage the regime she had helped adorn had left behind. That quiet, ordinary longevity is precisely what makes her story such a striking outlier. And to really understand why, we need to look closely at the women who stood alongside her at the top of Nazi society and see just how differently and how much more violently their own stories ended. We already began to meet Magda Goebbels earlier in this video, the fanatically devoted wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and one of Emmy's own social rivals at Berlin's grandest pre-war receptions. Her story is where the contrast with Emmy Göring becomes almost unbearably stark. As the Third Reich collapsed in the final days of April 1945, Magda Goebbels, along with her husband and their 6 young children, took refuge in the Führerbunker beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, sharing the same underground complex where Adolf Hitler was living out his final days. Magda's devotion to Hitler personally and to the ideology he represented had only intensified as the war turned catastrophically against Germany, and as Soviet forces closed in on the capital in the final week of April, she made a decision that stands as one of the single most horrifying acts committed by any figure connected to the Nazi regime, who was not directly responsible for the machinery of the Holocaust itself. Convinced that a world without National Socialism was not a world she wanted her children to grow up in, Magda Goebbels, with the assistance of an SS doctor, administered cyanide to each of her 6 children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Heide, ranging in age from 4 to 12, killing all of them inside the bunker on the night of May 1st, 1945. Shortly afterward, she and Joseph Goebbels went up to the Chancellery Garden and took their own lives as well, reportedly by a combination of cyanide and gunshot, ending a life that had begun with genuine intellectual ambition and cosmopolitan cultural interests and ended in an act of familial murder carried out in the name of an ideology that had already been thoroughly and catastrophically defeated. The horror of Magda Goebbels' final act tends to overshadow everything else about her life, and understandably so. But it is worth remembering that this was the same woman who had spent the 1930s competing with Emmy Göring over who could host the more dazzling Berlin reception, the same woman whose children bore names deliberately chosen to honour Adolf Hitler, the same woman Hitler had personally intervened to keep married to Joseph Goebbels, because their divorce would have embarrassed the party. The fanaticism that led her to murder her own children in that Berlin bunker had been building in plain sight for over a decade, expressed through her total identification with Hitler and the movement he led, an identification so complete that she ultimately concluded her children were better off dead than alive in a world without National Socialism. There is simply no equivalent moment, no comparable act anywhere in Emmy Göring's story. Emmy left the collapsing Reich with her daughter alive. Magda Goebbels left it having killed hers. Eva Braun's story, while less violent toward others, ended in a similarly fatal embrace of the regime's final collapse. Braun had met Hitler in the late 1920s when she was working as an assistant and photography apprentice for Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, and she became his companion sometime in the early 1930s, remaining almost entirely hidden from the German public for the following decade and a half. Unlike Emmy Göring, who was constantly photographed, celebrated in magazines, and presented publicly as a glamorous fixture of Nazi high society, Eva Braun was kept deliberately invisible, confined largely to Hitler's private world at the Berghof, absent from state occasions, and unmentioned in official propaganda, an arrangement that suited Hitler's carefully cultivated public image, but left Braun in a strange, isolated limbo for essentially her entire adult relationship with him. It is one of the sharper ironies of the entire story that Emmy Göring, without any formal claim to the position at all, spent years publicly performing the role of First Lady of the Third Reich, while the woman who was actually closest to Hitler personally remained locked out of public life entirely. That isolation ended only in the regime's final hours. As Soviet forces fought their way through the ruins of Berlin in late April 1945, Eva Braun made her way to the Führer bunker to be at Hitler's side, refusing multiple opportunities to flee to safety in Bavaria. On April 29, 1945, in a brief civil ceremony conducted inside the bunker, Eva Braun and Adolf Hitler were finally married, formalizing a relationship that had remained unofficial for roughly 16 years. Less than 2 days later, on April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops fighting only blocks away from the Chancellery, the couple retreated to Hitler's private study and took their own lives together, Hitler by gunshot and Eva by cyanide capsule, ending a marriage that had lasted barely 40 hours. Their bodies were carried into the Chancellery garden, doused in gasoline, and burned in a hurried, improvised cremation as Soviet shells continued to fall around the ruined government quarter. Braun was 33 years old. The pattern by now should be becoming clear. Magda Goebbels and Eva Braun both died in that same collapsing patch of Berlin real estate within a day of each other, both choosing suicide over any attempt to survive the regime's defeat, one of them taking her own children with her into death. Emmy Göring, 400 miles away in Bavaria at the time, chose a different path entirely, whether through circumstance, temperament, or simple distance from the epicenter of the regime's final collapse, and lived to answer for her association with Nazism in a courtroom, rather than escape it through a cyanide capsule in a besieged bunker. But the contrast doesn't end with Magda and Eva. Several other prominent Nazi wives took paths of their own after the war, and almost none of them look anything like Emmy's quiet, rebuilt life in a small Munich apartment. To understand just how unusual Emmy Göring's post-war trajectory really was, we need to look at what happened to Ilse Hess, wife of Hitler's one-time deputy Rudolf Hess, a woman who chose an entirely different kind of survival, one defined not by quiet withdrawal, but by decades of unbroken public defiance. Ilse Prühl met Rudolf Hess in the early 1920s, and the two moved in the same Munich circles that first drew them into contact with Adolf Hitler, whom Ilse is credited with helping introduce more deeply into her social world of educated, ambitious young nationalists. She joined the Nazi Party in 1921, dropped out during its period of illegality after the failed beer hall putsch, and rejoined in 1925 once the party reorganized. Her relationship with Hess developed slowly, by some accounts because Hess himself was hesitant to pursue it, but the couple eventually married on December 20th, 1927, in Munich, with Adolf Hitler in attendance and later serving as godfather to their only child, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, born in 1937. Ilse remained a committed, ideologically engaged supporter of the movement throughout the 1930s, standing firmly behind her husband as he rose to become Hitler's deputy Führer, one of the most powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy. Then, in May 1941, Rudolf Hess did something that stunned the entire Nazi leadership and effectively ended his political career overnight. He flew a fighter plane alone to Scotland in an unauthorised, almost certainly delusional attempt to negotiate a peace settlement with Britain, apparently believing he could convince the British government to abandon its alliance against Germany. British. Authorities immediately arrested him, and he spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, eventually standing trial at Nuremberg, alongside Göring and the other senior surviving Nazi leaders. He was convicted of crimes against peace and sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence he would serve, remarkably, for the rest of his life, spending over 4 decades in Spandau prison in Berlin, ultimately as its final and only remaining inmate before his death in 1987 at the age of 93. An apparent suicide by strangulation that some of his family and supporters have disputed ever since. Ilse Hess's response to her husband's decades of imprisonment set her apart sharply from Emmy Göring's quiet retreat into ordinary civilian life. Rather than fading from public view, Ilse spent the following decades as a tireless, visible campaigner for her husband's release, writing books, giving interviews, and cultivating a network of supporters who argued that Hess's continued imprisonment, particularly in his final years as Spandau's sole remaining prisoner, amounted to a grave injustice. She never publicly repudiated the ideology that had defined her adult life, and her advocacy work brought her into contact with a broader ecosystem of post-war Nazi sympathizers and Holocaust deniers who seized on the Hess case as a rallying point. Ilse Hess died in 1995 at the age of 94, having spent nearly her entire widowhood in the practical sense, not quietly rebuilding an ordinary life the way Emmy Göring had, but publicly and unrepentantly fighting to rehabilitate the reputation of a man who had been one of the chief architects of the very regime that plunged Europe into war. Where Emmy Göring wrote one memoir late in life and then largely receded from public attention, Ilse Hess spent 4.5 decades as an active, visible presence in exactly the kind of unrepentant, post-war Nazi advocacy that Emmy, whatever the self-serving gaps in her own memoir, never engaged in. A similar pattern of open, lifelong defiance defined the post-war life of Lena Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich, the SS general and chief architect of the Wannsee Conference, who had been assassinated by Czechoslovak resistance fighters in Prague in June 1942. Lena von Osten had married Heydrich in 1931 and remained, by most historical accounts, one of the more ideologically committed and personally ambitious wives among the senior SS leadership, reportedly encouraging her husband's ruthless rise through the ranks of Himmler's security apparatus. Widowed at the height of the war, with 4 young children and a fortune drawn substantially from properties and privileges tied to her husband's SS career, Lena survived the war's end with far less legal accountability than one might expect given her late husband's central role in planning the machinery of the Holocaust. She was never seriously prosecuted for her own conduct. In the post-war decades, Lena Heydrich settled on the North Sea island of Fehmarn, where she ran a guest house and became a locally recognizable and, to many observers, deeply unsettling figure who remained, according to numerous journalists and historians who interviewed her over the years, essentially unrepentant about the Third Reich and dismissive of the scale of its crimes well into old age. She gave interviews defending aspects of the regime, wrote her own memoir, and lived to the age of 89, dying in 1985, having spent over 4 decades as a publicly identifiable widow of one of the Holocaust's chief planners without ever offering anything resembling genuine remorse. Like Ilse Hess, Lena Heydrich represents the pattern Emmy Göring conspicuously did not follow. Survival without meaningful accountability, followed by decades of quiet or open defiance rather than any real reckoning. However imperfect Emmy's own reckoning ultimately was. So where does that leave the overall picture so far? 2 of Emmy Göring's closest social rivals, Magda Goebbels and Eva Braun, chose death over survival in the regime's final days, one of them taking her own children with her. 2 more prominent Nazi wives, Ilse Hess and Lena Heydrich, survived the war by decades and spent much of that survival unrepentantly defending the men and the movement that had defined their lives. Emmy Göring did neither. She survived, faced a genuine, if limited, legal reckoning, served her sentence, and largely withdrew from public advocacy for the rest of her life. But the list of contrasting fates doesn't end there, and in the next part of this story, we'll look at what happened to Gerda Bormann, Margaret Himmler, and one more woman whose post-war fate was, in its own way, even darker than Magda Goebbels's. Ilse Koch, the so-called bitch of Buchenwald, whose case shows that at least one Nazi wife did in fact face war crimes justice of her own, just not the woman most people assume. But before we get to Margarete Himmler and Ilse Koch, there's one more figure whose fate deserves close attention, precisely because her husband occupied a position of power rivaled only by Göring himself within the internal machinery of the Nazi state. Gerda Bormann, wife of Martin Bormann, the secretive party functionary who controlled access to Hitler's inner circle so completely in the war's final years that some historians consider him, in practical terms, the second most powerful man in Germany by 1945, even more influential day-to-day than the increasingly sidelined Göring. Gerda Buch had married Martin Bormann in 1929. With Heinrich Himmler serving as best man, and the couple went on to have 10 children together, a fecundity that fit neatly with the regime's obsessive promotion of Aryan family size, and that made Gerda something of a poster figure for Nazi pronatalist ideology. Gerda Bormann's ideological commitment ran deep, arguably deeper than Emmy Göring's ever did. She was a fervent believer in National Socialist racial doctrine and reportedly encouraged her husband's affairs, and even, according to surviving correspondence between the couple, expressed enthusiastic support for polygamous arrangements among senior party officials as a means of maximizing the birth rate of racially favored children, a chilling window into just how thoroughly Nazi ideology had colonized even the most intimate corners of some of these marriages. As the war turned against Germany and Allied bombing intensified, Gerda fled with her large brood of children southward, eventually settling in the Alto Adige region of northern Italy, then under German administration, seeking safety from both the bombing campaigns and the advancing Allied armies. She did not live to see much of the post-war world unfold. Gerda Bormann was diagnosed with cancer in the war's final stages and died on March 23, 1946, in Murano, Italy, less than a year after Germany's surrender, having never faced any legal reckoning for her own role in propagating the regime's ideology simply because illness claimed her first. Her husband Martin Bormann's own fate remained genuinely mysterious for decades. He was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death, but his body was not conclusively identified until 1972, when construction work near a former Berlin rail yard uncovered remains later confirmed through forensic analysis, and definitively through DNA testing in 1998, to be his, ending decades of rumours that he had escaped to South America like several other fugitive Nazis. Gerda and Martin Bormann's 10 children were scattered into the care of relatives and, in several cases, church-run institutions after their mother's death. Their family's central role in the machinery of the Third Reich reduced within less than a year of the war's end to a scattered group of orphans with a fugitive, and then a dead father whose fate remained unresolved for a generation. Gerda Bormann's story adds yet another layer to the pattern taking shape across this video. A wife whose ideological fervour for National Socialism was, if anything, more openly extreme than Emmy Göring's ever was, whose life ended not in a suicide pact or a war crimes trial, but in an ordinary tragic illness that struck before any accountability could be sought, leaving behind 10 children and a legacy of complicity that history never had the chance to formally weigh in a courtroom. Once again, Emmy Göring's path diverges. She did not flee to Italy with her child ahead of advancing armies. She did not die of illness within a year of the war's end, escaping judgment through nothing more than bad luck with her body's own cells. She stayed close enough to be captured, was formally judged by a denazification court, served her sentence, and lived on for nearly 3 more decades afterward. Coming up, we'll look at what happened to Margarete Himmler, the estranged wife of the architect of the Holocaust himself, and to Ilse Koch, whose story proves that a small number of Nazi wives did, in the end, face genuine war crimes justice for atrocities they committed with their own hands, a fate entirely different from anything Emmy Göring ever experienced. Margarete Himmler's story unfolds along yet another distinct path, one defined less by fanatical devotion or dramatic death than by a slow, quiet estrangement that nonetheless left her, like so many of these women, largely unaccountable for her proximity to one of history's greatest crimes. Margaret Boden, a divorced nurse 8 years older than Heinrich Himmler, met the future Reichsführer SS in the mid-1920s and married him in 1928, a union built partly on shared interest in homeopathic medicine and a small nursing home business the couple briefly ran together. Margaret was, by the accounts of those who knew the family, a rigid, ideologically committed anti-Semite in her own right, sharing her husband's racial worldview even as their marriage grew increasingly cold and distant through the 1930s and into the war years. The couple had one biological daughter, Gudrun, born in 1929, who would remain devoted to her father's memory and to the broader network of unrepentant former Nazis for the rest of her own long life, eventually becoming a prominent figure in West German neo-Nazi and Nazi support circles until her death in 2018. Heinrich Himmler, meanwhile, drifted away from Margaret over the course of the war, fathering 2 children with his mistress and secretary, Hedwig Potthast, in a long-term parallel relationship that Margaret was aware of but which she never formally divorced him over, perhaps in part because the SS itself, under Himmler's own policies, discouraged divorce among its senior leadership as a matter of ideological consistency. By the war's final year, Margarete and Heinrich Himmler were living almost entirely separate lives, their marriage a formality maintained more for appearances than out of any remaining connection. Heinrich Himmler's own end came swiftly after Germany's surrender. Captured by British forces while attempting to travel in disguise using a false identity, Himmler was identified during processing and, before he could be formally interrogated, bit down on a concealed cyanide capsule on May 23, 1945. Dying within minutes despite British medical efforts to save him. Margaret Himmler, for her part, was arrested separately and held in various internment facilities for a period after the war, questioned about her husband's activities and about the fate of assets and property connected to the SS, but she was ultimately never charged with any war crime or brought before a tribunal in any capacity resembling what her husband would have faced had he lived to stand trial. She lived out her remaining years quietly, largely out of public view, dying in 1967 at the age of 72, having faced essentially no legal reckoning whatsoever for her decades of marriage to and shared ideology with the man most directly responsible after Hitler himself for designing and overseeing the machinery of the Holocaust. Margaret Himmler's case is, in some ways, the closest parallel to Emmy Göring's own story among all the women we've discussed so far. A wife who survived the war, faced some period of Allied questioning and internment, and then largely disappeared into quiet, private life for the following decades. But the comparison only goes so far. Margaret Himmler was never formally convicted of anything by a denazification tribunal, and she left behind a daughter who spent her entire adult life actively promoting and defending the very ideology her father had helped implement with such catastrophic consequences. An ongoing legacy of unrepentant advocacy that has no real equivalent in Emmy Göring's own family. Eva Göring, unlike Gudrun Himmler, largely avoided public political advocacy throughout her life, living quietly and, for the most part, out of the public eye until her own death in 2018, the same year as Gudrun, coincidentally, though the two women's public postures toward their fathers' legacies diverged about as sharply as their mothers' post-war lives had. Which brings us to the one story in this entire video that breaks the mold in the opposite direction. A Nazi wife who did, in fact, face genuine war crimes justice, not for her marriage or her social proximity to power, but for atrocities she personally committed with her own hands. Her name was Ilse Koch, and her case demonstrates that when a Nazi wife's own conduct crossed from complicity into direct participation in mass atrocity, the post-war legal system was, at least occasionally, capable of treating her exactly like the perpetrator she was. Ilse Koch was married to Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of the Buchenwald concentration camp, and during her husband's tenure, she held informal but very real influence over conditions inside the camp, developing a reputation among prisoners and later among Allied investigators as an especially sadistic and predatory figure. She was accused, and substantial evidence supported the accusations, of selecting and directing the killing of prisoners for her own personal cruelty and gratification, including allegations contested in their exact details, but broadly supported by surviving testimony and physical evidence, that she had ordered the creation of household items, including lampshades, from the tattooed skin of murdered prisoners, a horror so grotesque it earned her the nickname the Bitch of Buchenwald among survivors and later among the press covering her post-war trials. Unlike every other woman discussed in this video, Ilse Koch was not merely a bystander benefiting from a criminal regime. She was, by the weight of the evidence against her, an active, direct participant in some of the camp's most horrific individual atrocities. She was arrested by American forces in 1945 and tried by a US military tribunal in 1947, convicted and initially sentenced to life imprisonment, though that sentence was controversially reduced to 4 years by the American military governor of the occupation zone, a decision that provoked outrage among survivors and in the American press and led to a congressional investigation into the leniency of the reduction. West German authorities, unwilling to let the matter rest, subsequently retried Ilse Koch in their own courts in 1950 on charges connected to the incitement of murder within the camp. And this second trial resulted in a sentence of life imprisonment, a sentence that, unlike her first, actually stuck. Ilse Koch spent the following 17 years in prison, growing increasingly unstable by the accounts of those who monitored her incarceration, and on September 1, 1967, she died by suicide in her cell at Aichach Women's Prison in Bavaria, hanging herself using bedsheets rather than face the remainder of a life sentence for crimes that, even among the extraordinary catalogue of Nazi-era atrocities, stood out for their personal, direct sadism. Ilse Koch's fate matters enormously for understanding the full spectrum of what happened to Nazi wives after the war, because it demonstrates that the legal system was not entirely blind to gender when serious direct criminal conduct could be proven. She was tried twice, convicted twice, and ultimately died in custody serving a life sentence, a genuinely severe legal reckoning, harsher by far than anything Emmy Göring ever experienced. But the crucial distinction is this. Ilse Koch's punishment followed direct evidence of personal participation in murder and torture, conduct entirely different in kind from Emmy Göring's role as a socially prominent hostess who benefited from, but did not personally direct, the regime's atrocities. Emmy was never accused of anything resembling what Ilse Koch was convicted of, and rightly so. There is no credible evidence she ever participated in violence against a single individual. The denazification court that judged her in 1948 judged her for complicity and benefit, not for murder, and sentenced her accordingly. The contrast between Ilse Koch's fate and Emmy Göring's fate is, in its own way, exactly as instructive as the contrast between Emmy's fate and Magda Goebbels's. It shows just how wide the range of culpability and of consequence actually was among the women who occupied the domestic and social periphery of the Nazi regime's senior leadership. So let's take stock of the full picture that has emerged across this video so far. Magda Goebbels murdered her own 6 children and then killed herself and her husband in a Berlin bunker, the single most horrifying end suffered by any figure in this story. Eva Braun married Hitler and died beside him by cyanide less than 2 days later, having spent 16 years hidden from public view before finally, briefly, achieving the recognition she may have craved, only in the final hours of her life. Ilse Hess survived her husband's 46-year imprisonment and spent decades as an outspoken, unrepentant advocate for his rehabilitation, dying at 94, having never meaningfully broken with the ideology that defined her adult life. Lena Heydrich outlived her assassinated husband by over 4 decades, running a guest house on a German island while remaining, according to virtually every journalist who interviewed her, defiantly dismissive of the regime's crimes until her death at 89. Gerda Bormann, perhaps the most ideologically fanatical of all these women, died of cancer within a year of the war's end, escaping any legal accountability not through survival and quiet withdrawal like Emmy, but through the simple, indifferent timing of a terminal illness. Margaret Himmler faded into quiet, unaccountable private life after her husband's suicide, leaving behind a daughter who spent her life as an unrepentant advocate for Nazi memory. And Ilse Koch, the one woman among them who personally committed direct atrocities rather than merely benefiting from the regime that enabled them, was tried twice, convicted twice, and eventually took her own life in a German prison cell after 17 years behind bars. Emmy Göring's story sits apart from every single one of these paths. She did not die by suicide, alone or alongside her husband. She did not kill her own children or anyone else. She did not spend her remaining decades as a public advocate for the rehabilitation of National Socialism, unlike Ilse Hess or Lena Heydrich. She did not escape accountability through the accident of an early death from illness, unlike Gerda Bormann, and she was never accused of, let alone convicted of, direct personal participation in murder or torture, unlike Ilse Koch. Instead, she faced a real, if limited, legal process, served a modest sentence proportionate to the more limited nature of her actual offence, lost a significant portion of her wealth, and then simply lived for 27 more years as an ordinary private citizen in a rebuilt German city, occasionally revisiting her past in a self-serving memoir, but never again approaching the kind of public prominence or public advocacy that had defined her first 50 years. Is that a happy ending? Almost certainly not the right word for it. Emmy Göring benefited enormously for over a decade from a regime that industrialized mass murder, and the year she spent in a labor camp and the 30% of her property that was seized amount to a strikingly modest price for that decade of benefit, especially when measured against the scale of suffering the regime she glamorized inflicted on millions of people across Europe. But measured purely against the other women who occupied her same social tier at the summit of Nazi Germany. Women who died by their own hand, who murdered their own children, who spent decades unrepentantly defending the indefensible, or who escaped judgment only through the accident of early death, Emmy Göring's post-war trajectory really does stand apart. She is, in the strictest and most literal sense of the phrase, the outlier of the group, the one Nazi wife who simply survived defeat, faced a measure of consequence, and grew old. What made her different? Was it something in her own character, some capacity for adaptation and self-preservation that the more ideologically fused wives like Magda Goebbels or Gerda Bormann simply never developed? Was it circumstance, the fact that she was in Bavaria rather than besieged Berlin during the regime's final collapse, giving her an escape route the bunker's occupants never had? Or was it something more troubling? A kind of moral flexibility that allowed her to genuinely believe, or at least convincingly perform belief, in whatever version of events best suited her survival at any given moment, first as the glamorous First Lady of a 1,000-year Reich, then as a chastened defendant before a denazification tribunal, and finally as a wounded, misunderstood widow in the pages of her own memoir decades later. Historians who have studied her case have never fully agreed on an answer, and perhaps there isn't a single, clean one. What is clear is that whatever combination of temperament, timing, and circumstance shaped her path, it produced an outcome fundamentally unlike anything experienced by the other women who shared her rarefied position at the top of Hitler's Germany, and that alone makes her story worth understanding in its full complexity, rather than reducing her either to a simple villain or an innocent bystander. One more comparison is worth drawing before we return fully to Emmy Göring's own final chapter, because it complicates the picture in an important way. Annelies von Ribbentrop, wife of Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, offers a case that in some ways mirrors Emmy's survival, but diverges sharply in attitude. Born Anna Elisabeth Henkel, heiress to the wealthy Henkel champagne-producing family of Wiesbaden, Annelies married Joachim von Ribbentrop in 1920, years before he had any connection to the Nazi movement at all, and by most contemporary accounts she was, if anything, the more politically driven and more ideologically committed partner in the marriage, reportedly pushing her husband toward party membership and wielding considerable influence over his career decisions as he rose from wine salesman to German ambassador to Britain and eventually to foreign minister of the Third Reich. Joachim von Ribbentrop was convicted at Nuremberg and became the first of the condemned defendants hanged on the night of October 16, 1946, dying, by multiple accounts, badly, in a botched execution that left him strangling for several minutes, rather than receiving the quick death a properly calculated drop was meant to provide. Anneliese herself was interned by Allied authorities, including a period of detention at the former Dachau concentration camp complex, now repurposed to hold Nazi-era internees. And unlike Emmy Göring, she was reportedly never formally processed through a denazification tribunal in the same way, though lengthy legal battles over her substantial inherited fortune continued for years. She emerged from internment with her family's wealth largely intact after protracted litigation, and rather than withdrawing from public life the way Emmy did, Anneliese spent much of her remaining years writing books and articles explicitly defending her husband's actions and reputation, remaining, in the assessment of most historians who have examined her post-war record, an unrepentant and committed National Socialist until the end. She died on October 5, 1973, in Wuppertal at the age of 77, just 4 months after Emmy Göring's own death that same year. Two women who had occupied similarly rarefied positions in Nazi high society and who died within months of one another, but who spent their final decades in almost opposite postures. One largely silent and withdrawn after a single explanatory memoir, the other an active, lifelong public defender of a regime that had murdered millions. There is one further wrinkle worth including here because it complicates any simple narrative of Emmy Göring as merely a passive beneficiary of the regime's crimes. Historical accounts, including comparative surveys of Nazi-era wives, note that a small number of these women occasionally used what limited influence they had to intervene quietly on behalf of individuals facing persecution, a detail that doesn't erase the larger picture of complicity, but does add nuance to it. Emmy Göring is occasionally cited in such accounts as having made scattered personal interventions on behalf of individual acquaintances, generally people from her pre-war theatrical and social circles, though the surviving documentation for the scope and frequency of such interventions is thin and inconsistent, and historians differ on how much weight to give it. A more thoroughly documented case belongs to Henriette von Schirach, wife of Vienna's Nazi governor Baldur von Schirach, who is recorded as having personally confronted Hitler over the treatment of Vienna's Jewish population after witnessing deportations firsthand, an act of conscience that reportedly resulted in her permanent banishment from Hitler's presence for the remainder of the war. These details do not rehabilitate Emmy Göring, and this video is not attempting to argue that they should. A handful of quiet, poorly documented personal favours extended to pre-war acquaintances does not offset a decade spent as the glamorous public face of a genocidal state. But an honest historical account has to sit with the genuine complexity, rather than flattening every figure into a single, uncomplicated category. And Emmy Göring, more than almost any other woman in this story, resists easy categorization. Neither a monster on the order of Magda Goebbels or Ilse Koch, nor an innocent bystander, but something messier and more human, a woman who enjoyed the spoils of a criminal regime for over a decade, faced a real if inadequate legal reckoning for it, and then spent the rest of her long life as an ordinary private citizen, largely avoiding the kind of unrepentant public advocacy that defined so many of the other women who had once shared her position at the summit of Hitler's Germany. It is a strange, almost anticlimactic ending for a woman who once styled herself First Lady of a 1,000-year Reich, and that very anticlimax is precisely what makes her case worth remembering. With that fuller picture in view, let's turn to the final chapter of this story. Exactly how Emmy Göring's own daughter, Edda, carried the family name forward into the 21st century, and what her long life reveals about the complicated, unresolved legacy that children of the Third Reich's leadership carried with them for the rest of their days. Edda Karin Wilhelmina Göring, born June 2, 1938, spent her earliest years living the life of what more than one biographer has since called a little princess of the Third Reich, raised largely at Karinhol amid priceless looted artworks, a child-sized playhouse built specifically for her, and a private cinema, baptized there on November 4, 1938, with Adolf Hitler himself standing as her godfather. That fairy tale childhood ended abruptly at age 6, when her father was arrested, tried, and ultimately took his own life rather than face the gallows, and when her mother was sent to serve a sentence of her own for the family's Nazi affiliations. Edda and Emmy were held together during their internment, and after their release, mother and daughter rebuilt a life together in a small apartment in Munich's Altstadt-Lehel district. 5 flights up in a modest modern residential block, a striking come-down from Carinhol's marble halls and looted masterpieces. Edda pursued a modest professional path entirely unlike the ceremonial world her mother had once occupied. She studied law at the University of Munich and worked as a clerk in a law firm, later training to become a technical medical assistant and working in a hospital laboratory. A quiet, unremarkable career that stands in almost comic contrast to the 500 planes that had once flown over Berlin to celebrate her birth. She also spent years locked in legal battles of her own, fighting to reclaim jewellery, artwork, and other items that had been given to her at birth as gifts to the Reichsmarshal's newborn daughter and subsequently confiscated by Bavarian authorities as tainted assets of the Nazi regime. In 1954, she succeeded in forcing the state of Bavaria to return jewellery valued at roughly 150,000 German marks, but her broader campaign to recover looted art, including a Renaissance-era painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder that had been presented to her as an infant by the city of Cologne, ultimately failed. A final petition, in 2015, when Edda was in her late 70s, was rejected by a Bavarian court in a hearing that reportedly lasted only a few minutes, with the state affirming that the artwork, having been looted from its rightful owners in the first place, was never legitimately Hermann Göring's, to give away as a gift, regardless of the sentimental or familial claims his daughter continued to press 7 decades later. Edda Göring never married and had no children, and for years she cared for her aging mother in that same small Munich apartment until Emmy's death in 1973. In the 1970s, she formed a 5-year relationship with Gerd Heidemann, a Stern magazine journalist who had purchased Karin II, the yacht that had once belonged to her father, and the couple reportedly hosted former senior SS and Wehrmacht officers aboard the vessel during their years together, a detail that underscores just how long an informal social network of former regime insiders and sympathizers persisted in West Germany decades after the war's end. Unlike her mother, who largely withdrew from public commentary about the Nazi period after her single 1967 memoir, Edda gave at least one notable television interview to Swedish broadcasters in 1986, in which she spoke warmly and defensively of her father, describing her love for him and pushing back against characterizations of him purely as a war criminal, a stance she reportedly maintained privately for the rest of her life, keeping a Göring family crest displayed in her apartment as a quiet, persistent expression of loyalty to a name most of the world remembered only for its association with mass atrocity. Edda Göring died in Munich on December 21, 2018, at the age of 80, though German authorities did not publicly confirm her death for nearly 3 months afterward. She was buried in an undisclosed, unmarked location, a decision made deliberately by the authorities handling her affairs to prevent the grave from becoming either a target for desecration or, just as concerning to German officials, wary of the country's ongoing struggle with far-right extremism, a site of pilgrimage or reverence for neo-Nazi sympathizers. It was a strange, quiet coda to a life that had begun with 500 aircraft roaring over Berlin in celebration and Adolf Hitler personally attending a baptism, and that ended 80 years later in a grave whose very location had to be kept secret from the public for the nation's own safety. Between Emmy's quiet death in 1973 and Edda's quiet death in 2018, the Göring women had, in their own way, completed a remarkable transformation. From the most photographed family in Nazi Germany to 2 women who died decades apart, largely out of public view, their final resting places deliberately obscured, rather than celebrated. Now, with the fuller picture of both Emmy Göring's own remarkable post-war path and her daughter's long, quiet coda in view, it's worth returning one final time to the central question this video set out to answer, and to the handful of details about Emmy's life and death that rarely make it into shorter accounts of her story. There are a handful of smaller, stranger details about Emmy Göring's life that rarely make it into the standard, condensed retellings of her story, but that add real texture to the picture of who she actually was, beyond the simple label of Nazi wife. One of the more curious is literary rather than historical. Emmy was caricatured while she was still alive and at the height of her social prominence in Klaus Mann's 1936 novel Mephisto, a scathing satire of actors who compromised their integrity to thrive under the Nazi regime. Mann, the son of the famous novelist Thomas Mann and himself an exile from Hitler's Germany, based the character of Lotte Lindenthal, a former actress who marries a senior Nazi official and becomes a glittering fixture of Berlin high society, unmistakably on Emmy herself. The novel, later adapted into an Academy Award-winning 1981 film, offers a rare contemporary literary judgment on Emmy's transformation from respected stage actress to regime hostess, rendered by a writer who understood the German theatre world intimately and who watched from exile as colleagues and acquaintances made exactly the kind of accommodation with Nazism that Emmy had made so publicly and so completely. Another detail worth pausing on is the sheer scale of press attention Emmy commanded during the pre-war years, a level of celebrity coverage that Time magazine itself captured when it reported approvingly on her closeness with the Göring family circle, noting at one point that Hermann and Emmy Göring had become fast friends with associates across European high society. An observation that captures just how thoroughly Emmy had been absorbed into an international social world that, in the mid-1930s, had not yet fully reckoned with what the Nazi regime actually represented. It is worth remembering when assessing Emmy's later claims of political naivety and apolitical detachment that she spent years cultivating exactly this kind of visibility, courting press coverage, posing for illustrated magazines, and positioning herself deliberately at the centre of the regime's social calendar. The claim that she was merely a passive, apolitical figure swept along by her marriage sits uneasily next to the historical record of a woman who worked quite visibly to build and maintain a public identity as the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich. There is also the matter of her health in later life. Emmy suffered from sciatica, the same painful nerve condition that afflicts millions of ordinary people around the world, radiating pain down the lower back and legs, and by several accounts it worsened considerably in her final years, limiting her mobility and confining her increasingly to her small Munich apartment. It is, on its face, an almost absurdly mundane detail to include in the story of a woman who once presided over receptions attended by the most powerful and murderous men in Europe. But that mundaneness is precisely the point. The First Lady of the Third Reich spent her final years dealing with the same unglamorous physical ailments that afflict ordinary aging women everywhere, a far cry from the violent, dramatic ends that claimed so many of the other wives in this story. She died, in the end, not from a cyanide capsule, not from a hangman's rope, not by her own hand in a prison cell, but from what appears to have been the ordinary decline of old age, in her own apartment or a Munich hospital, at 80 years old, having outlived the regime she had once glamorized by nearly 3 decades. It's also worth asking, honestly, why the denazification process treated so many of these women, Emmy included, with such comparative leniency, because understanding that broader context helps explain why her outcome, while unusual among her specific social circle, was not entirely unusual for German women more broadly in the immediate post-war years. The Allied occupation authorities, faced with the staggering logistical challenge of screening tens of millions of Germans for Nazi affiliation, developed a 5-tier classification system, running from major offenders down to those exonerated entirely, and the system was applied with wildly inconsistent rigour depending on the occupation zone, the specific tribunal, and the political pressures of the moment. By 1948, when Emmy's case was finally heard, the initial intensity of denazification efforts had already begun to wane considerably, as the emerging Cold War redirected Western priorities toward rebuilding West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet influence, rather than continuing an exhaustive reckoning with the Nazi past. Historians have long noted that this shift in priorities meant many Germans who might have faced harsher scrutiny in 1945 or 1946 received comparatively lighter treatment by 1948, and Emmy Göring's own case, tried at almost exactly this transitional moment, likely benefited from that broader institutional drift toward leniency, even as the tribunal formally classified her in the more serious, incriminated category rather than dismissing her case outright. None of this excuses or erases the underlying question every fair account of Emmy Göring's life eventually has to confront. How does a person weigh a decade of glamorous, willing participation in the social apparatus of a genocidal regime against a comparatively modest year in a labour camp and a partial property seizure? There is no clean formula for that calculation, and reasonable people who take the history seriously can and do land in different places. What can be said with confidence, though, is that Emmy's outcome was not simply a matter of some special personal virtue that set her apart from Magda Goebbels or Ilse Hess or Lena Heydrich. It was, in significant part, a function of timing, geography, and the practical limits of what post-war denazification tribunals were willing or able to punish, layered on top of whatever personal choices Emmy herself made in the years that followed her release. She was not punished for the full weight of her complicity. But unlike so many of her peers, she was punished for some of it, however inadequately. And then she chose, or was perhaps simply inclined by temperament, to live out the remainder of her life quietly, rather than continuing to fight publicly for the rehabilitation of a cause that had already cost the world tens of millions of lives. It's worth returning, one final time, to the full roster of women whose lives this video has traced, because laid side by side, the pattern is genuinely striking. Magda Goebbels murdered 6 children and then herself. Eva Braun died by her own hand less than 40 hours into her marriage to history's most notorious dictator. Ilse Hess spent nearly half a century as an unrepentant public advocate for her imprisoned husband's rehabilitation. Lena Heydrich ran a guest house on a quiet German island for over 40 years while remaining defiantly dismissive of her husband's central role in planning the Holocaust. Gerda Bormann, perhaps the most ideologically fanatical of them all, escaped any reckoning entirely by dying of cancer within a year of the war's end. Margaret Himmler faded into an unaccountable private life while her daughter carried the family's unrepentant legacy forward into the next century. Annelies von Ribbentrop spent her post-war decades writing books defending a husband who had been hanged, however badly, for his role in enabling the Holocaust. And Ilse Koch, the sole figure in this entire story who personally committed direct atrocities rather than merely benefiting from a regime that enabled them, was tried twice, convicted twice, and eventually died by her own hand in a German prison cell after 17 years behind bars. Against that backdrop, Emmy Göring's trajectory looks almost startlingly ordinary, and that ordinariness is exactly the point this video has tried to make. She was not innocent. She spent over a decade at the glittering center of a regime built on plunder, persecution, and eventually genocide, and she enjoyed every material comfort that regime's crimes made possible. But when the whole edifice collapsed, she did not choose murder, and she did not choose martyrdom, and she did not choose decades of unrepentant public advocacy for a cause that had already been thoroughly and catastrophically discredited by the mountains of evidence produced at Nuremberg and by the ruins of the country she had once helped glamorize. She chose instead, or perhaps simply drifted into, the far less dramatic path of quiet survival. A year in custody, a shrunken fortune, a small apartment, a single explanatory memoir late in life, and then 27 more years of ordinary private existence until sciatica and old age finally caught up with her in the summer of 1973. Is that the opposite of every other Nazi wife? In the narrow, literal sense, no single person can be the precise opposite of an entire group of women whose individual stories varied as wildly as the ones traced in this video. But in the sense that matters most for understanding her particular historical significance, the answer is genuinely yes. Among the small, rarefied circle of women who stood at the absolute summit of Nazi Germany's social hierarchy, wives of the men who planned wars, ran death camps, and orchestrated the machinery of the Holocaust, Emmy Göring is the rare figure whose story ends not in violence, not in decades of unrepentant advocacy, and not in an early accountability-dodging death, but in something far stranger and, in its own quiet way, far more unsettling. An ordinary old age spent in an ordinary apartment in a country slowly and imperfectly rebuilding itself from the wreckage that she, in her own limited but very real way, had once helped adorn. What does it mean that the woman who once crowned herself First Lady of the Third Reich ended her life indistinguishable, on the surface at least, from any other elderly widow in post-war Munich, troubled by sciatica, writing a memoir nobody was forced to believe, quietly outliving nearly everyone who had once shared her rarefied position at the top of Hitler's Germany? Perhaps it means that history rarely offers the kind of clean, satisfying moral resolution that a simpler story would demand. Perhaps it means that the machinery of post-war justice, for all its genuine achievements at Nuremberg, was never fully equipped to reckon with the particular, diffuse complicity of the women who glamorized and legitimized a criminal regime without ever pulling a trigger or signing an order themselves. Or perhaps it simply means that Emmy Göring, whatever else she was, turned out to be far better at the ordinary, unglamorous work of surviving than any of the extraordinary, catastrophic women whose names now share the history books alongside hers, women who chose, in their own ways, to burn rather than fade, while she, alone among them, simply grew old. It's worth pausing too on what became of Karen Hall itself, the estate that had served as the physical stage for so much of Emmy's glittering pre-war life, because its fate mirrors the broader collapse of everything she had once represented. As Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin in the final weeks of the war, Hermann Göring, unwilling to let his beloved estate and its priceless looted art collection fall intact into enemy hands, ordered Karen Hall destroyed. In April 1945, German engineers detonated explosives that reduced the sprawling hunting lodge to rubble, an act of deliberate self-destruction that stands as a fitting, almost theatrical bookend to the entire arc of the Göring family's rise and fall. What art and valuables could be moved beforehand were evacuated by rail in the war's final chaotic weeks, packed into freight cars and shuffled around the collapsing Reich in a desperate, ultimately futile attempt to keep them out of Allied hands. American forces eventually located much of the collection, an enormous trove that included old master paintings, tapestries, sculptures, and countless smaller objects, many looted directly from Jewish collectors, museums and galleries across occupied Europe, and the slow, painstaking process of identifying rightful owners and returning stolen property occupied Allied restitution officers for years afterward. A process that, as we've already seen through Edda's own decades-long legal battles, was never fully completed, and remains, in certain contested cases, unresolved even today. The site of Karen Hall itself, in the Schorfheide forest north of Berlin, remains largely undeveloped rubble and forest to this day, deliberately left in ruins by post-war German authorities, rather than rebuilt, a physical absence marking the spot where Emmy Göring once played hostess to the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. There's also a broader story worth telling here about the German entertainment industry Emmy came from, because her transformation from respected stage actress to regime hostess was far from unique, even if the scale of her particular ascent was unusual. The Nazi regime understood the propaganda value of German cinema and theatre from its earliest days in power, and it moved quickly to bring the entertainment industry under state control through the Reich Chamber of Culture, established in 1933, which required all working actors, directors, and performers to register and demonstrate their political and racial acceptability in order to continue working at all. Jewish actors, directors, and theatre professionals, some of whom had trained alongside Emmy in the same Weimar and Hamburg theatre circles she came up in, were systematically purged from the industry, stripped of their livelihoods, and in many cases eventually deported to concentration camps and murdered. The German stage and screen that Emmy had built her pre-war career within was, by the mid-1930s, an industry that had already been thoroughly cleansed of its Jewish talent, its unions and guilds reorganized under Nazi control, and its remaining non-Jewish stars, actors like Emmy herself, given every incentive, financial, professional and social, to align themselves publicly with the regime that had engineered that purge. Understanding that context doesn't excuse Emmy's choices, but it does help explain the environment she was operating within. An entertainment industry where political conformity had become, quite literally, a professional survival requirement years before she ever married Hermann Göring, and where marrying into the regime's senior leadership represented not a break from her professional world's logic, but its ultimate, most extreme extension. There's a natural question worth asking at this point. How much did Emmy actually know about the specific atrocities being carried out by the regime she had married into? It's a question that applies in various forms to nearly every figure in this video, and the honest answer for Emmy, as for most of the others, is almost certainly complicated and probably shifting over time. The systematic murder of Europe's Jews was, by design, conducted with considerable operational secrecy, carried out primarily in occupied territories far from the daily social world Emmy inhabited in Berlin and at Karen Hall. But the broader persecution of German and Austrian Jews, the boycotts, the exclusion from professions, the Nuremberg laws stripping Jewish Germans of citizenship in 1935, the November 1938 pogrom known as Kristallnacht that saw synagogues burned and Jewish businesses smashed across the entire country in a single coordinated night of violence, all of this was conducted openly, in plain view, and it is simply not credible to imagine that a woman married to one of the regime's most senior officials, living inside a household furnished substantially by confiscated Jewish property, could have remained genuinely ignorant of the persecution underlying her own privileged existence. Whether she understood the full industrialized scope of the eventual genocide, the death camps, the gas chambers, the sheer numerical scale of the murder campaign, is a somewhat separate question, and one that even her husband at Nuremberg spent considerable energy trying to obscure and minimize in his own testimony, denying detailed knowledge of the final solution's mechanics, even as prosecutors presented documents bearing his own signature, authorizing its planning. Hermann Göring's Nuremberg testimony itself deserves a moment of attention here, because it shaped in real time how the watching world understood not just him, but, by extension, the entire apparatus of wives, family members, and social intimates who had surrounded him. Göring proved, to the visible frustration of the prosecution, an unexpectedly formidable defendant, articulate, controlled, and often able to parry cross-examination with a combination of technical legal argument and unapologetic ideological conviction that stood in sharp contrast to the more visibly broken or evasive testimony offered by several of his co-defendants. He acknowledged his own role in building the Nazi state's early apparatus of repression, including his founding role in creating the Gestapo, while simultaneously working to distance himself from the specific mechanics of the death camps, insisting that operational control of the final solution had passed to Himmler and the SS well before its most murderous phases began. The tribunal was not persuaded on the core counts. It found ample documentary evidence, including his own July 1941 authorization empowering Reinhard Heydrich to prepare a complete solution to what Nazi documents euphemistically called the Jewish question in German-controlled Europe, sufficient to convict him on all 4 charges brought against him. But his performance in the dock, defiant, controlled, occasionally even darkly charismatic according to observers, cemented a public image of Göring as perhaps the most unrepentant and formidable of the surviving Nazi leadership, an image that inevitably coloured how the watching world, and later historians, understood the wife who had stood beside that image for over a decade. It's worth asking, too, what Emmy's own memoir actually reveals beyond its obvious function as a defence of her reputation. My Life with Göring, published in English in 1972, the year before her death, offers a portrait, however self-serving, of a marriage that Emmy insisted, to the end, had been built on genuine love rather than political calculation, and of a husband she continued to describe in terms of personal warmth, generosity, and charm, rather than the historical judgment that had already, by the time she wrote, settled firmly on Hermann Göring as one of the 20th century's great criminals. She wrote extensively about their courtship, their wedding, the birth of Edda, and the family's life at Carinhall, dwelling at length on domestic and personal details while offering comparatively little serious engagement with the crimes her husband had been convicted of, or with her own proximity to the machinery of persecution that had funded her lifestyle for over a decade. It is, in that sense, a fairly typical example of a genre that would recur again and again in the decades following the war. Memoirs by the family members of senior Nazi officials that acknowledge the broad historical verdict against their relatives in the abstract, while working, often quite skillfully, to carve out a private, personal narrative of love, loyalty, and mitigating circumstance that sits uneasily alongside that verdict. Whether such memoirs represent genuine self-deception, calculated reputation management, or some complicated mixture of both is a question that applies just as much to Emmy Göring's book as it does to the similar volumes published by Ilse Hess, Lena Heydrich, and Annelies von Ribbentrop, each of them offering their own version of the same fundamental argument, that the men history had condemned were, in the private, domestic sphere these women alone had access to, something more complicated, more human, and more sympathetic than the historical record allowed. There is a final layer of complexity worth sitting with before we close this story out, and it concerns the question of how much any of this should actually matter to viewers watching from the 21st century, nearly 80 years removed from the events themselves. Why does the specific manner in which Emmy Göring, or Magda Goebbels, or Ilse Hess met their post-war fates carry any real historical weight beyond simple, morbid curiosity? The answer, we'd argue, lies in what these divergent paths reveal about the mechanics of accountability itself, about how societies actually process complicity in mass atrocity once the initial shock of defeat has passed and the difficult, unglamorous work of assigning consequence begins in earnest. The Nuremberg trials themselves represented an extraordinary, unprecedented legal achievement, establishing for the first time in history that senior state officials could be held individually criminally responsible for crimes against peace and against humanity, rather than hiding behind the traditional shield of state sovereignty. But Nuremberg, by its very design, focused overwhelmingly on the small handful of men who had held formal command authority. The much larger, much murkier question of how to handle the wives, the social hostesses, the family members who had benefited enormously from the regime's crimes without personally directing them, was left largely to the far less rigorous, far more inconsistently applied machinery of denazification, and the wildly divergent fates traced across this video, from Ilse Koch's genuine war crimes conviction, to Gerda Bormann's accidental escape via terminal illness, to Emmy Göring's modest year in a labour camp, illustrate just how imperfectly that secondary system of accountability actually functioned in practice. Understanding Emmy Göring's story, in other words, isn't just about one unusual woman's unusual survival. It's a window into the much larger, still unresolved question of how any society reckons with the people who cheer, who host the parties, who wear the jewels bought with plundered wealth, and who benefit quietly from the crimes that history eventually condemns, without ever personally pulling a trigger themselves. To fully appreciate what Emmy Göring stepped into when she married Hermann in 1935, it helps to know a little more about the woman she was, in a sense, replacing. Karin von Kantzow, Göring's first wife, whose brief life and early death cast a long shadow over the entire Göring household for the rest of the Reich's existence. Karin was a Swedish noblewoman, already married to another man when she met Hermann Göring in 1920. And the two fell into a passionate affair that eventually led to her divorce and their marriage in 1923. Karin suffered from tuberculosis and a serious heart condition for essentially their entire marriage, a chronic illness that worsened considerably during the lean, difficult years following the failed 1923 beer hall putsch, when Göring, wounded during the attempted coup, fled Germany with Karin into a period of exile, morphine addiction stemming from his own war wound treatment, and genuine poverty across Austria, Italy, and Sweden. Karin's health finally gave out in October 1931, and she died in Sweden at the age of 42, 2 years before the Nazi seizure of power that would have made her, rather than Emmy, the wife of the Third Reich's second most powerful man. Göring never fully set aside his grief for Karin, and the estate he built in the Schorfheide forest, Karinhall, stood as a permanent monument to her memory, complete with an elaborate mausoleum on the grounds where her remains were eventually reinterred, after being moved from Sweden in 1934, in a ceremony attended by Adolf Hitler himself. Emmy, remarkably, appears to have made her peace with this arrangement, living for over a decade in a household organised quite literally around the memory of her husband's first wife, its central estate named for her, its most sacred ground occupied by her tomb. It is a strange, almost Gothic detail that rarely makes it into shorter accounts of Emmy's life. The woman who styled herself First Lady of the Third Reich spent years playing hostess inside a house built as a shrine to her predecessor, a domestic arrangement that says something perhaps about the particular kind of emotional accommodation Emmy was capable of making when the alternative was walking away from the power, wealth and prestige that came with the Göring name. The wedding itself, on April 10th, 1935, deserves a slightly closer look because its sheer theatrical scale captures just how completely the Nazi regime had, by that point, mastered the art of turning private life into public spectacle. The ceremony at Berlin Cathedral was choreographed with military precision, guests arriving in a procession of official cars, uniformed SS and Luftwaffe honor guards lining the cathedral steps, and the streets outside packed with spectators who had turned out, whether from genuine enthusiasm or simple curiosity, to watch the country's second most powerful man marry his actress bride. Adolf Hitler in one of his relatively rare public appearances. At a purely social occasion rather than a political rally, stood as best man throughout the ceremony, a role that carried enormous symbolic weight in a society that had, within just over 2 years of the Nazi seizure of power, already learned to read every gesture from its Führer as a form of political theatre. The Luftwaffe flyover that followed, squadron after squadron of aircraft roaring low over the cathedral in salute, doubled as both wedding celebration and none too subtle demonstration of German air power, at a moment when the country was in open violation of the disarmament provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, having publicly revealed the existence of the supposedly forbidden Luftwaffe only weeks earlier. Even Emmy and Herman's wedding, in other words, functioned simultaneously as romance, regime propaganda, and military signal to the rest of Europe, a fusion of the personal and the political that would define virtually every aspect of Emmy's subsequent public life. It's worth setting that spectacle against the deteriorating circumstances of ordinary Germans as the war progressed, if only to underscore just how insulated Emmy's world remained from the hardship the regime's policies were inflicting on the broader population, let alone on the millions of victims across occupied Europe. By 1943 and 1944, German civilians were living under strict rationing of food, clothing and fuel, enduring increasingly devastating Allied bombing campaigns that reduced major cities to rubble and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and facing growing shortages of virtually every basic good as the war economy consumed the country's remaining resources. Harrenhal, by contrast, remained stocked with fine food, wine and game, from Göring's private hunting grounds throughout most of this period, its cellars and pantries maintained at a level of abundance that would have seemed almost fantastical to an ordinary German family queuing for rationed bread in a bombed-out city. Emmy continued hosting guests, continued dressing in furs and jewellery, and continued living, by every available account, essentially unaffected by the material deprivation reshaping the rest of German society, a disparity that did not go entirely unnoticed even within Germany itself, where quiet resentment of the Nazi leadership's continued luxury amid growing wartime hardship became one of the small but real sources of eroding public morale in the war's final years. There's one more figure worth briefly introducing here, not because she was a wife in the same sense as the others in this video, but because she occupied a parallel position of prominence among Nazi Germany's most visible women, and offers yet another point of contrast. Gertrude Scholz-Klink, head of the National Socialist Women's League and the highest-ranking woman in the entire Nazi party hierarchy. Scholz-Klink, unlike Emmy, held genuine institutional authority, overseeing a mass organisation that claimed millions of members and that promoted the regime's ideology of women's roles, centred on children, kitchen and church, the notorious Kinder, Küche, Kirche formula that defined official Nazi doctrine on womanhood. She remained a committed, outspoken defender of National Socialism for the rest of her extraordinarily long life, giving unapologetic interviews well into old age, briefly imprisoned by French occupation authorities after the war for possessing forged identity documents while attempting to evade capture, but never seriously prosecuted for her role in propagating Nazi ideology among German women. She died in 1999 at the age of 97, having lived nearly the entire second half of the 20th century as an unrepentant former Nazi official. One final data point in the broader pattern this video has traced. Survival, for the women of the Third Reich's upper ranks, was common, but genuine accountability, and even more so, genuine remorse, remained the rare exception rather than the rule, with Emmy Göring's comparatively brief imprisonment and largely private later life standing as one of the few examples that split the difference between the two extremes. It's also worth asking how popular culture and documentary filmmaking have handled Emmy's story in the decades since her death, because the answer reveals something about which parts of this history tend to capture public attention and which parts get quietly left out. Emmy Göring rarely receives the same sustained biographical treatment afforded to Eva Braun or Magda Goebbels, whose more dramatic, more violent final chapters have made them recurring subjects of documentaries, dramatized films, and popular history books. Emmy's story, by contrast, tends to appear in shorter form, often folded into broader compilation pieces about the wives of the Nazi leadership, rather than treated as a standalone narrative in its own right, precisely because her ending lacks the cinematic drama of a bunker suicide or a murder-suicide involving 6 children. There is a real irony in that pattern. because the very quality that makes Emmy's story less immediately dramatic, the fact that she simply survived, faced modest consequences, and grew old, is exactly what makes her case so genuinely revealing about how accountability for complicity in mass atrocity actually tends to unfold in the real world, as opposed to the more satisfying, more narratively clean versions of justice that dramatic suicides and murder trials tend to offer. One last comparison rounds out the picture, and it comes from outside Germany's own borders, because the broader Axis alliance produced its own gallery of powerful men's wives who faced their own varied reckonings once the war ended. And setting Emmy Göring against at least one of them helps confirm that the pattern traced across this video wasn't simply a quirk of the specific German case, but part of a much larger recurring historical question about how societies handle the wives and companions of fallen dictators and their inner circles. Eda Ciano, daughter of Benito Mussolini and wife of Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano, offers perhaps the most striking parallel, not least because, as we noted earlier in this video, some accounts claim Emmy's own daughter was named in her honour. Eda Ciano watched her husband, who had turned against Mussolini and voted for his removal from power in 1943, subsequently captured by German forces after Mussolini's rescue and installation as the puppet leader of the so-called Italian Social Republic, and put on trial for treason at Verona in January 1944, a trial stage-managed substantially by the Germans and by a vengeful Mussolini himself, determined to make an example of the son-in-law who had betrayed him. Despite Eda's desperate efforts, including smuggling out her husband's incriminating diaries in an attempt to negotiate his release, Galeazzo Ciano was executed by firing squad on January 11, 1944, shot in the back as a mark of particular disgrace reserved for traitors. Eda herself fled to Switzerland, was interned there for a period, and eventually returned to Italy after the war, living out the remainder of her life largely out of the political spotlight, dying in 1995 at the age of 84, having published her own memoirs decades earlier, defending her husband's legacy while distancing herself from her father's regime. Her story, watching helplessly as the fascist machinery she had been born into consumed her own husband, offers yet another variation on the theme this video keeps returning to. Survival was common among the women who stood closest to fascism's most powerful men, but the specific path each woman's survival took and the degree of accountability or defiance that defined the decades afterward varied enormously from case to case, shaped by individual temperament as much as by the accidents of geography, timing, and circumstance that determined who was captured where and by whom in the war's chaotic final weeks. It's worth closing this comparative survey with a broader reflection on what all of these women's stories, taken together, actually teach us about the nature of complicity itself, because that is really the deeper subject this video has been circling around from the very beginning. Every one of the women discussed here occupied a position of extraordinary privilege inside a regime that inflicted almost unimaginable suffering on tens of millions of people, and not one of them personally designed a death camp, signed an extermination order, or commanded troops in the field. Their complicity, where it existed, was of a different, subtler kind. Complicity through proximity, through benefit, through the social legitimacy, their presence at the regime's grandest occasions helped confer on men who were, quite literally, planning and executing genocide in rooms not far from where these same women were arranging flowers and selecting gowns for the evening's reception. History has never developed a fully satisfying framework for weighing that kind of complicity. The complicity of the hostess rather than the commandant, the wife rather than the war criminal, and the wildly divergent post-war fates traced across this entire video, from bunker murder-suicide to war crimes conviction, to accidental escape via terminal illness, to Emmy Göring's own comparatively modest year in a labour camp, stand as a kind of unintended, natural experiment in just how inconsistently and how imperfectly that framework was ultimately applied. Perhaps the most honest conclusion to draw is that there was never going to be a single, uniform answer to the question of what these women deserved, because the underlying moral questions, how much does proximity to evil implicate a person who did not personally commit it? How much does material benefit from atrocity create a debt that must eventually be repaid? How much should genuine ignorance, however implausible, mitigate judgment, resist the kind of clean, universal answer that a courtroom verdict is supposed to provide? What the post-war tribunals and denazification courts actually produced across dozens of individual cases like the ones surveyed in this video was less a coherent system of justice than a scattered, inconsistent patchwork of outcomes shaped as much by luck, geography, and shifting occupation-era political priorities as by any considered judgment about the relative moral weight of each woman's individual choices. Emmy Göring happened to land within that patchwork on the more fortunate end of the spectrum, judged, sentenced, and released rather than escaping judgment entirely through death or evading it through decades of unrepentant public defiance. Whether that outcome represents rough justice, historical accident, or simply the practical limits of what any legal system could realistically accomplish in the shattered, chaotic aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, remains even 8 decades later a genuinely open question, and one this video hopes has given you the historical context to consider for yourself, rather than a single, tidy answer to accept without examination. Before we close, it's worth remembering just how young this entire cast of women once was when their stories began, a detail easy to lose sight of once their names become permanently attached to the historical catastrophe their husbands helped engineer. Emmy Sonnemann was already 41 years old when she married Hermann Göring, a mature, established professional woman, rather than a naive young bride swept off her feet, a fact that makes her later claims of political innocence somewhat harder to credit than they might be for a younger, less worldly figure. Magda Goebbels was 30 when she married Joseph, already twice divorced in effect, having ended one marriage and broken an engagement to a Jewish businessman before her fateful introduction to the Nazi movement through Hitler's own social circle. Eva Braun, by contrast, was barely 20 when she first caught Hitler's attention. A detail that complicates any simple narrative of equal culpability across every woman in this story, since the power imbalance between a 23-year-old shop assistant and photography apprentice and a 40-year-old political leader already commanding a mass movement was considerably starker than the dynamic between Emmy and Hermann Göring, two accomplished adults who met on comparatively equal footing within Weimar's theatre and political social scene. These differences in age, experience, and relative power at the moment each relationship began don't excuse any of what followed, but they do add another layer of nuance to any attempt at a simple, uniform moral judgment of Nazi Germany's most prominent wives, reminding us that even within this small, notorious circle of women, the paths that led them into complicity with history's most murderous regime were themselves far from identical. And what of the objects that outlasted all of them? The jewellery, the paintings, the estates, the very name Göring itself? Much of the art looted through Hermann Göring's collecting has never been fully returned to its rightful heirs, scattered across museum basements, private collections, and ongoing restitution disputes that continue in courtrooms across Europe even now. 8 decades after the war's end, and more than half a century after Emmy Göring's own death. Provenance researchers still occasionally uncover pieces once catalogued at Carron Hall, surfacing in unexpected collections, each rediscovery reopening the same unresolved questions about ownership, restitution, and historical justice that Eda Göring spent decades litigating unsuccessfully in Bavarian courts. In that sense, the story this video has told is not entirely finished even now. The women themselves are gone. Emmy in 1973, most of her contemporaries within a decade or two afterward, Eda as recently as 2018, but the material legacy of what they lived through, the plundered wealth, the contested provenance, the unresolved questions about who owes what to whom for crimes committed nearly a century ago, continues quietly working its way through archives, courtrooms, and museum storerooms around the world. A reminder that history's reckonings, however imperfect, are rarely as final or as complete as any single video or any single life could ever fully capture. And that, in the end, might be the truest way to understand Emmy Göring's strange, uncomfortable distinction among the wives of Hitler's inner circle. She is remembered not because her story offers a clean moral lesson, and not because she represents either the depths of Nazi fanaticism or a genuine exception to it, but because her long, quiet, unremarkable survival forces us to sit with a harder truth than any bunker, suicide, or war crimes conviction ever could. That history's great catastrophes are rarely brought about or answered for, only by the small number of men who give the orders. They are built, sustained, and glamorized by an entire surrounding apparatus of hostesses, spouses, and social fixtures whose own reckoning, when it finally comes, is almost always messier, quieter, and far less satisfying than the story we might wish to tell. Emmy Göring lived that messier, quieter reckoning out in full for 27 years in a small apartment in a rebuilt city. And in doing so, she left behind a story that resists the easy categories of villain and victim far more persistently than almost any other figure to emerge from the wreckage of the Third Reich. It is a story without a tidy moral, without a satisfying final punishment or a redemptive final confession, and perhaps that unresolved, unglamorous quality is exactly why it deserves to be remembered, alongside the more dramatic, more frequently told stories of the women who stood beside her at the summit of Hitler's Germany. Well, that's it. We hope you found this video informative and gave you a deeper look at just how differently the women of the Third Reich's inner circle met their fates once the regime they had helped glamorize finally collapsed around them. If you enjoyed learning about Emmy Göring's remarkable and unsettling story, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, where we cover even more of these women in depth, and our video on what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II, which follows figures like Eva Göring and the other sons and daughters who inherited their parents' impossible legacies. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. Thanks for watching, and until next time.